Good afternoon. It's so nice to see everyone on such a beautiful sunny day. I'm Ann Goodyear, one of the co-directors of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and today it is my special pleasure to introduce our speakers, Richard Rinehart and Jon Ippolito, both of whom I have long admired. Both Richard and Jon are highly respected experts in the field of new media art and have offered critical leadership as curators and as founders and directors of departments of organizations to study new media, as well as serving as critical theorists and historians for the field. At a moment when digital technology offers an increasingly significant tool through which we assess and analyze information, both Rinehart and Ippolito have critical insights to offer by way of guidance and by means of interrogating habits, tools, and practices in our own lives that we may take for granted. Rick Rinehart is the director and chief curator of the Samek Art Gallery and Downtown Gallery at Bucknell University. He has served as digital media director and adjunct curator at the UC Berkeley Art Museum, and he has been a member of the board of directors for numerous organizations involved in digital and new media art, including the Berkeley Center for New Media, New Langton Arts, the Museum Computer Network, and has led NEA and NEH-funded national research projects on new media, art, preservation, and museums. His curatorial and writing projects include a recent exhibition and related catalog on the work of R. Luc Dubois at the Samek, entitled Portraits and Landscapes. Jon Ippolito is co-founder of the University of Maine's New Media Department and Stillwater, a new media research and development laboratory. While a curator at the Guggenheim Museum, Jon established the Variable Media Network, which established critical ways of defining and strategizing about the preservation of new media, for which technical obsolescence can be a key challenge. In addition to addressing digital media in the context of the art museum, Jon has also helped to develop digital tools, such as ThoughtMesh, which provides users with a tag-based model for publishing and discovering scholarly papers online. And, oops. That was my reminder that everybody should turn off their phones. And the Pool, an online project design workspace that stimulates collaboration in a variety of forms, including multi-author, asynchronous, and cross-medium platforms. In 2015, Jon was the inaugural recipient of the Toma Foundation Digital Arts Writing Award in recognition of his important contributions at the intersection of art and technology. In 2014, Jon and Richard published their co-authored book, Recollection, Art, New Media, and Social Memory, a pioneering and highly lauded contribution to addressing the theoretical and technical demands of conserving, exhibiting, and collecting new media art. The publication offers concrete examples that range from the work of Nam June Paik to Danger Mouse to R. Luc Dubois. Today, Richard and Jon will each offer a short presentation that will jointly address the work of Dubois and the broader history of new media art, addressing what it means from philosophical and technical standpoints to collect, exhibit, preserve, and study new media. Their presentations will be followed by a conversation that I will moderate and will then conclude with questions from the audience. Please join me in welcoming Rick and Jon.
Howdy. Let me get set up here. I really want to thank Ann and the Bowdoin Museum and their staff and Bowdoin College for having us today. It's a real pleasure to come here. So let me do one thing on screen here. I'm gonna blow this up. This is a piece by R. Luc Dubois called Vertical Music. You may recognize it. I'm going to start it over. It's officially starting right now. So this piece is in the exhibition, DuBois-Now, at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. And it's a piece that I exhibited when I had a show of his work last fall, and it has entered into, I collected it for the Samek permanent collection as well. And we thought that it would be fun to show this, not only because my remarks will pertain to collecting works of new media art like this work here, but also this work, and it also spans us, it's in the exhibition. It's about 45 minutes long, and our program is about 45 minutes long. So we thought that we would sort of invite Luke to be here in absentia and to keep time for us. So when this piece ends, our program ends. So I'll just leave it up on screen for you to watch. And maybe I'll briefly, if I can, turn up the audio just to give you a little sample, although I'll turn it back down. There we go. So this was, he got 12 musicians to record a piece of music that he had composed, and then he filmed them for about 4.5 minutes, and then stretched out the recording and pitch corrected the music so that the piece plays for 45 minutes. So Luke is all about stretching and compressing time, and we thought that would be sort of an interesting thematic for today's remarks. So I'm going to present to you in very short order 3 questions that come to me as a museum director and collector of works like this. 3 questions or problematics, I guess, and maybe we can take them up later on in our discussion. And I think I would like to point out to you that all of my questions are non-technical. They're not technological in nature, although the art itself is defined by its technological substrata. So let me get right into them. First of all, what is it exactly that we're collecting? Even when I'm collecting this work, I mean, this is a theoretical question that I've written about and thought about for years and years, but even at a very practical, operational level, when we're collecting a work like this, I have to have that conversation with Bitform Gallery and with the artist. What exactly are we collecting? A painting, by comparison, when I go to see the painting in the artist's studio, it's the same painting. If I go to see it in the basement of the gallery, it's pretty much the same object. When I put it up for exhibition in my museum, it's the same object. And then when I collect it and put it away in storage in the vault, it's pretty much, to any third-party observer, the same object. But with a work like this, or any new media work, that relationship breaks down. So this is the artwork Vertical Music by Luc Dubois that you'll see in exhibition. This is Vertical Music as it sits in my museum collection. And this may seem like a difference that is so obvious as to be dumb to even raise the question about. But it raises ancillary questions, such as, which of these 2 objects should be the focus of our descriptive practices? Which should we catalog? Which should be the primary focus of our cataloging and description? Or more importantly, what should be the primary focus of our preservation efforts? Preserving this or preserving that? Those are no small questions for me to grapple with, and they really are as different as this and that. Then I wonder, too, about the hermeneutic questions. For exhibition purposes, when I collect this work, I'm going to answer my own question that I raised earlier a little bit. I would argue that things like this can be swapped out and replaced. This is really the target of my preservation efforts. This is the artwork that I want to bring back to life. But as easy as that sounds, and as many years as I spent formulating that opinion, I still have to question it as a director, because I know that museum collections serve history, and they serve many different future constituents. So 50 years in the future, when the Samek Art Museum wants to exhibit this work, it'll be good enough to exhibit that work. But museum collections also serve the purpose of research. And when a researcher wants to come and look at the collection, I wonder about how our collecting practices and the materiality of the object reflect the historicity of the artwork. You know, that this artwork came from a very specific place and time. This will remain the same, but as long as this keeps being upgraded, future researchers coming to visit the collection for those purposes and to study this work's place in technological history, social history, may be as interested to see this as they are to see that. Which then makes me wonder, are we back at square one? Do I then have to preserve that and this, and every variation of this that I use in the future to replace the storage for that thing? And am I, as a small museum, equipped and ready and able to preserve all of working copies of all of the versions of technology that we use to instantiate this work in the future? And I fear the answer to the latter one is no, so that really is an open-ended question. And then I asked myself, what kind of language should I use to describe this work? Trained as an art historian, I know that for different genres and medias, we have incredibly nuanced and detailed language for describing works. Say, printmaking, for instance. You know, we can talk about the state of a print, the edition, the imprint. All of these things describe very specific qualities and aspects and differences between different instances of a print. There's another work that I've collected into our collection from the Our Luc Dubois show called Star Spangled Banner, SSB, which is an audio piece. Now, it's described by Luc on his wall label, at least the wall label that's in Bowdoin, as a 4-channel audio work. Now, when we showed it at the Samek Art Museum, we showed it on we presented it, it's an audio work, so we presented it using 6 speakers. So it was either a 4-channel work presented over 6 channels, or it was turned into a 6-channel work. The work, as it's presented at the Bowdoin Museum right now, is using 2 speakers. So it's a 2-channel work, a 4-channel work, and sometimes a 6-channel work. We don't really have any accurate, detailed, rigorous way of describing the differences that occur in media art in the same way that we do, for instance, printmaking. First of all, the question, what variations within a work even constitute a different version? Is what I showed at the Samek a different version of this work than what you're showing here at Bowdoin? And if so, are all differences called differences in version? Do we only have one word to describe every single kind of difference? We don't have that nuanced list of imprint, state, edition, etc., to talk about different changes in the state of the artifact. Similarly, with language, I wonder about describing in detail the qualities of the work. We have in painting, for instance, to look at that genre and that medium, you know, again, we have pretty detailed and rigorous language for talking about the visual effects, the way that painters can use the medium of paint to produce a visual effect for the viewer, you know, so chiaroscuro or sfumato to present these different kinds of visual effects. With new media art, interactivity is one of the main tools that new media artists often employ to produce an effect, or an affect for that matter, with the audience. Some works, like this one, are not particularly interactive in the digital sense. They're highly interactive in the artistic sense, but in a digital sense, you observe it from afar. And then there's, at the opposite end of the extreme, you know, World of Warcraft or something, where viewers are coding tools and swords and domiciles inside of the game to share with other people and affect the flow of gameplay for themselves and others. That's a deep level of interactivity. We really have no rigorous way of describing interactivity and the nuances of it and how it's used to produce an effect with the audience in the same way that we do chiaroscuro and sfumato and all of the lexicon that we have for describing painting. And language is, of course, important. So I'm going to conclude by saying that we also can't work through these things in theory. We can't get together at conferences or even publish papers and actually work through these questions. What we must do is collect this work. Museums need to collect more of this work. The Samek Art Museum has embarked on an initiative to begin to build a collection of born digital artworks as a signal genre of contemporary and 21st century art. I think it's important that museums recognize this and begin to write history accurately by collecting this stuff. My understanding is that the Bowdoin Museum also has about 3 pieces of media art in the collection. That puts us both in the top 10 media art collections in museums in the world. 3 pieces, which is pretty sad when you think about it. Can you imagine if your museum had 3 photographs and that put you in the top 10 photographic collections in the world? Well, that's the way it is with media art. We're in a sort of sad state. Very few museums are collecting it, and even those that are, and I include some of the most prominent and largest museums in America are collecting a relatively few number of these things. We can only work through these kinds of muddy questions in collecting the work, in the practicalities and the operational realities of collecting it that bring up the more theoretical, nuanced questions that we then get to consider. The art historian Julian Stallebras a few years ago wrote a great essay called "Can Art History Digest Net Art?" And I think in the years since that was written, the art world has slowly tried to digest net art, but at this point, it's stuck in the gullet. And my call and my question to my museum peers is, at this point, we need to figure out whether we're going to spit or swallow. John? There you go.
All right, I'm on the clock here. Thanks, Rick, and thanks to Anne Goodyear, one of my favorite digital humanities people in Maine and in the world, for inviting me. I'm not sure if I'm going to spit or swallow. I guess I'll swallow the bait. I will include a little food in my talk, but I won't throw it at you. Collecting Time is the name of the show, and well, not the name of the show, but it's the name of this talk about the show. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what relationship that has to the work in more perhaps interdisciplinary and philosophical even forms, what it has to do with our jobs as folks who are interested in this kind of digital world that art and other forms of creativity exist in, and what it would mean to collect time. So Collecting Time in a Bottle, of course, is a Jim Croce song, which I will make reference to later, but it does raise this question of if it is the subject, increasingly, of our job as museum professionals in a world where time-based media and time as a thread imbues so many works, so much of today's creativity. If you can't walk through the DuBois show without seeing time everywhere, how do we collect that time? I think one of the first jobs, I'll just mention some inspirations, a digital curation program that I helped found at the University of Maine where we think through these issues, and of course the book that Anne mentioned that Rick and I did. First job is to decide what time is. Okay, so we could go a lot of different directions with this. I'll just stop with the physicist's definition of time. A mathematical concept, a parameter that helps make sense of relationships, different kinds of relationships. So a mathematician will take a complicated graph like this that would be very hard to do with an x and y variable and parameterize it by one variable, t, that helps you track where you are on the graph at any given time. And that's, from a mathematical perspective, time is just a parameter that makes sense of disparate things. But I could say, okay, then what do physicists do with that? Well, Stephen Hawking, in A Brief History of Time, says time is a parameter that's correlated with certain things in the physical universe. And it's, one example is the Big Bang. Time starts with the Big Bang in an interesting way. It's interesting also that Luke describes one of his projects as having a Big Bang. It is the Big Bang of his kind of collective email documentation, and I'll mention that in a moment. But that certain arrow of time, the arrow from the Big Bang forward, Hawking correlates with entropy, right? This idea that things get messier as time goes on. They don't you don't walk back to your room and suddenly all your laundry is kind of neat in a corner and there's no dust anywhere. And then finally, free will is actually another concept that that Hawking kind of theorizes are all part of this notion of time. And this single arrow, time is a way of correlating these three arrows together. Well, everybody's heard of Stephen Hawking. Very few people have heard of Ilya Prigogine, a Belgian physicist responsible for this book called From Being to Becoming, and an author, a recipient of a Nobel Prize himself, but someone who is very interested in the concept of time and has a relationship to, or a way of describing time as a kind of mixing. And it's an interesting notion, but he has this quote, "The irreversibility of time is the mechanism that brings order out of chaos." So that's a way of thinking about this notion of entropy as not necessarily a bad thing, but actually as a good thing, something that brings order, something that mixes things together. And I think one of the best ways of describing what he's talking about is bread. I told you I'd get to food. So in the traditional notion, or the traditional sort of metaphor, an events sort of unfold in time. We say, well, something caused something and then it unfolded as though that's what's happening as things progress. Prigogine has a different, he doesn't use this metaphor, but I'm sort of grafting it onto his theory. He says, well, if you really want to think about time and its relationship to entropy, then you have to think about what happens when you make, say, a croissant. Okay, you need filo dough, which is a very thin layer of cold dough that you roll out, and then you put butter on top of that, and then the next thing you do is you fold it. Okay, it's called the baker's transformation. So I'm getting an object that at first has two things that are very distinctly separated, butter and bread, dough, and then when I stretch them out and then fold them back on themselves, they are now connected in a way they weren't before. And I continue this process until I get this wonderful dough that, when baked, creates this nice flaky crust. Well, the idea behind Prigogine's theory is that this is a lot like entropy. Things start out far apart, separated, and then end up being mixed together. And you think of this in the way that, if you drop milk into a coffee cup, the milk sort of diffuses into the coffee. It doesn't just separate out in one corner and leave the brown coffee on the other side. Or if you leave your bills on a table, you're not going to come home later and see them neatly stacked. More likely, they'll have been neatly stacked at the beginning of the week, and they'll be spread out over your table by the end of the week. So this notion that things tend to move toward conditions in which they are mixed is related to the thermodynamic concept of entropy as one where there are more and more ways that this can be than that can be. So the probability is that you always move toward a condition that's more mixed. That's how his theory connects what Hawking says are the two entropies of time, our perception of the universe as well as a perception that things get more messy or more entropic. Well, if this is true, if really time is a mechanism that mixes things together, then it's not really correct to say that events unfold in time. In fact, what they do, they fold in time. It's the exact opposite. And that seems a little bit arbitrary, but think about the idea of time as something that takes an initial condition with separated, whatever they be, billiard balls, atoms, and then over time, they interact with each other and they form connections. So rather than think of time as a linear sort of stratum that unfolds in this kind of linear highway into the future, think of it as something that instead folds up into a stack, if you will, of interconnected relationships between the parts that were initially separated. In other words, time is vertical. And of course, vertical music is the title of the piece that Rick started with. The idea that all of these separate composers individually may start separated into their own, little icons in the grid, but once they start playing music, and music, let's face it, is the purest sort of art of time, then all of the different elements that they contribute to that musical composition become united, or become interrelated, I should say. Sometimes by unison, sometimes by opposition, but there's a relationship created between those separate performers and the notes they make. And that's what music is. So if we start to think of time that way, then when I look at DuBois' show upstairs, I see lots of different ways that things are folded together. Folded in the sense of relationships made that weren't necessarily there before, but unfold in time, or I should say, fold in time. And it's not always time that is our perception of time, right? That kind of folding is something that you can document when there is an existing timeline that you're pursuing, like the musicians in vertical music, but also alternative timelines, ways things could have been folded or could be folded that aren't currently folded. So for example, this piece, Acceptance, thank you, is a remix of two acceptance speeches, one by Barack Obama and one by Mitt Romney, of their party's nomination for the last presidential party candidate. And what's great about it is that it chops up the videos and correlates the speeches. So at the time when Obama is talking about, say, children, the effect on children of the current economic situation, that's what Romney's talking about. They both mention children at the same moment. Or when Obama's talking about China, Romney's talking about China. And that really fascinating sort of refolding of the timelines of two separate events into each other, so that they kind of talking about the same thing at the same moment, is a really interesting sort of way that these are interwoven, that DuBois has managed to weave together two speeches that really should be compared side by side, but never are when you look at them in the TV. Another example of that is missing connections. Again, the title suggests I'm trying to associate things that were not normally there. That's various offerings and requests on Craigslist that didn't know about each other, but they're identified by common words. And so if these people only knew, this person's lonely, this person's gregarious, if they only met each other, even though they're in different cities or posted at different times, they might make a perfect couple, or someone might be able to buy a bicycle and someone else might be able to sell it. And that idea that you're creating mixing and folding that wasn't there before is a really interesting kind of extrapolation of this physical idea of mixing as time, folding as time. Well, okay, how does that help us collect time, right? Because that's the job as museum professionals in a world where increasingly the world has these kinds of relationships and so on. Well, one of the ways we've thought about it in the past is to create a memento, something that can be passed on to future generations. So Jim Croce's famous, song, "If I Could Collect Time in a Bottle," it was something that he actually wrote for his unborn son in 1972. 1973, dies in a plane crash. That's what his son has for him. Okay, and those of you who are old enough to remember, the song is very emotional and has this whole kind of feeling of almost a nostalgia, and yet it's this kind of predictive nostalgia because, of course, he didn't know he was going to die, and that's what he left his son. Again, music is a paradigmatic example here, and one that DuBois uses all over the place if you go up through the show, because music is, in this case, it's an MP3 file or a record, a LP that you can pass on to your progeny and the future. But it's also, as Rick has noted, a very good model for thinking about how to preserve these kind of interactive works, or I should say, complex relations, because it has its notation. Music has a notation that identifies how those parts mix together. And these performers could not play together or not repeat the work together if they didn't have a score to work from. So that gives you a sense of music as a kind of paradigm that we might look to for preserving complex media art. Now, how do we go from there to saying, what about things like, those algorithmically generated, images and websites and complex interactive pieces that we see up there? How would we preserve those? Those aren't musical. We can't just preserve a musical score. There's a computer involved. There might be interaction from people. They're scraping data off of Craigslist. Well, that's where I think we have to forge those connections ourselves. We have to, in essence, create time, or a time renewed for each of the works we want to collect. And can I see a few suggestions for how we might do that? Unfortunately, museums stink at this. They're terrible at preserving relationships, right? Rick has noted elsewhere that we tend to isolate fragments. We take them out of context instead of keeping them in their original context, whether it's the Elgin marbles that we pull out of the Pantheon, or other sort of websites that we download without keeping any of the links that were very important to them. And that means that when you put something in a crate, more than likely, if it's one of these complex media works, you're also consigning it to a mausoleum. It's going to die. Storage is not a good model. Isolation is not going to help preserve the time qualities of these works. And how have museums reacted to this when we complain about it? Again, time is just a parameter. Museums, I think of time as this linear thing. All I have to do is kind of put this thing in a crate and set it on this road to the future. But it's not linear. It's about mixing. It's about folding things together. So you've got to capture more than just that one aspect. Let me give you one example. The horrific time-based media description. I despise this, even though it's the more forward-thinking museums are glomming onto this because they're like, oh, well, okay, maybe we can understand all these complex media artists and artworks by calling them time-based. The problem for me there is that they're thinking of time-based, again, in that linear sense. Example, this is Ken Jacobs, a sort of avant-garde American filmmaker. He has a series of works in the Bitemporal Vision series. Let me see if I can bring up one here. They're really wild. He takes two different projectors and projects them on the same surface. You cannot imagine it. This is a videotape of it, and you can't really see it from here, which is sad. But maybe you get a little sense of the way it creates a sort of three-dimensional image. But when he actually does it live with these two film projectors, he trains them on the same spot on the screen, takes the same about 30 seconds of film, two pieces of celluloid, exactly the same, and sort of adjusts them up and down in the sprocket wheels of the projector. And then in front is sort of a propeller-like strobe. And what it does is it creates these three-dimensional kind of billowing effects that are just amazing. I mean, it makes some Hollywood 3D Avatar movie look completely flat. But the problem is when museums get this work, they go, okay, it's film. I can deal with film. We got a time-based department. We take film, we put it in cold storage. We might even migrate it to safety film to make sure it doesn't have vinegar syndrome or any of these other problems that older film storage things took. Well, that's great, but remember, he's just got 2 little strips of celluloid. That's like a prop, basically, for him. He's performing these 2 projectors and the celluloid to create this remarkable effect. And the script, the projectors, the artist's intent, all that's lost if you just think of it as time-based media. So one of the developments of the Variable Media Initiative that Anne referred to is interviewing the artist and talking to him and other people related to the piece about what is important to preserve. Is it really the film strips alone, or are there other aspects that we have to capture in order to preserve those relationships? Well, that's sort of a one-on-one thing. We can meet individually with the artist. What about preserving relationships en masse, right? We've got huge amounts of generated culture out there in the world, and as museums, we might want to take into account that. Well, I think one of the answers is suggested by the self-portrait that DuBois did up in the gallery, where he did an analysis actually of his email, and he created a force-directed graph that showed who emailed who most often, who were so the correlations between those people, and then you get this kind of map of relationships. Now, that might be a hard thing to imagine doing by hand for every person's email, say, but there are ways to imagine doing it with, say, a photograph, as in this Instagram example. This is a famous photograph many of you have seen before on the cover of National Geographic in I don't remember exactly when the National Geographic magazine was, but it was taken in 1984 by an Afghani woman found in a Pakistani refugee camp. It was remarkable. Everyone thought it was wonderful, but a lot of people said, hey, this is an image, you don't even know who this woman is. You took it out of context and you've lost all of the socioeconomic kind of meaning of the piece and replaced it with a beguiling woman. So the photographer, Steve McCurry, went back to Afghanistan and tried to track this woman down. And it took him until 2002, that's 18 years, to finally find Sharbat Gula, the woman who this is a photograph of. That's how long it took to identify the context, 18 years of that original photograph. We don't need to wait that long anymore. In the digital age, we can see a photograph like this. How many have seen this photograph before? Okay, the younger people in the room. That's from a couple Oscars ago. It broke Twitter, right? This photograph went everywhere, became super famous, and it's basically, Ellen DeGeneres taking a selfie. So you imagine the Oscars, they've got, people being paid, incredible 6-figure salaries, best, most professional photographers in the room. What's the one photograph that goes out? Someone's selfie from a cell phone. Why? Because it was connected to a network, right? Went out over Twitter, Instagram. And if we think about the difference between those 2 cases, yes, both of them have a relationship historically and to certain social groups. But this one, we have the data already. They're out there in the network, right? Something like Twitter offers a goldmine for people who are trying to reconstruct the social context of a photograph. In other words, all of the relationships between all those people can be mapped as a model for gathering the context, for understanding those intimate relationships between the users of a photograph, the people who created the photographs, the people who just passed it on and retweeted it. That gives us a much broader sense of what culture means in an age where relationships can be more important than the individual image. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to continuing the conversation with Anne and Rick.
Move these out to the middle of the ring, as it were. Because when it goes off, we're done.
Okay, we have 2 microphones for 3 speakers, which will hopefully help us not interrupt one another too much. But it is such a pleasure to hear from both of you. It is exciting, I think, as we begin to contemplate this movement into the digital era, to think about the stakes of this move. And I do think time is a terrifically interesting strategy to begin thinking about the work of our Luc Dubois. And one of the things that I find very compelling is the title that curator Matthew McClendon selected for the exhibition, which is Our Luc Dubois Now. And so I like the fact that the exhibition itself forces us to think very much about the context of the here, but now perhaps is implicitly a moment that does not have duration. It is fully present to us. We recognize that it is a changing marker, but it is something, I think, that perhaps conveniently allows us to forget about the fact that there is a past that we are simultaneously trying to capture. Another observation that I'll just offer quickly is one of the very fortuitous relationships that I think we've been able to set up in our exhibition of Dubois' work is between our Assyrian reliefs, which are 3,000 years old, and Luc Dubois' portrait of Doré McKesson, which is actually the newest work in our collection. So there's something really interesting, I think, going on there about time, perhaps analogies about how information flows over time, similarities and differences. But Jon, as you observed, on some level, this is something that museums claim to do of their very nature, to give us some way to archive, to preserve, to capture at least an illusion of time in duration, which perhaps allows us to reflect a little bit on the now. And I wonder if I might be able to begin with a question to you, having offered those observations, and then Rick, as a museum director, to ask you to chime in. And as you think about challenges and demands for museums that are seeking to grapple with this problem of temporality, you mentioned some of the inadequacies sometimes of what we attempt to do. Might you be able, each of you perhaps, to offer some alternative models or ways of thinking about how we might step back from this desire to think about time in a linear fashion? Are there ways in which we might be able to begin to unpack and problematize this issue, perhaps by rethinking the way in which we present our collections?
It's great that you bring up the title of the exhibition, or Luc Dubois Now. And you're right, it implies this kind of eternal now. And I think that's the eternal now of the museum. That's what the museum offers, right, is a timeless state, not a timed state. So I think the answer is to sort of involve us back in the mucky trenches of time. And I sort of think about that museum timeless state as being reflected analogously in an essay by Michael Fried a long time ago about abstract expressionist painting, and how that kind of painting presented sort of an eternal now. And then he was denigrating at the time the minimalists and how they relied on this unfolding of mundane pedestrian time. You had to move around the sculptures with your body, to experience them and to fully realize them. So he was calling that theatrical, that sort of presence, sort of theatrical presence that occupied sort of this mundane, worldly time, as opposed to that which is exhibited by the abstract expressionist painters, this gestalt, this sort of sudden spiritual epiphany where you're suspended in time. So in a way, I'm sort of using that as a foil and saying, museums are sort of like, sort of present the promise of that timeless time, that gestalt, that spiritual epiphany. And I think I would argue that we need to sort of take things back, not only operationally. I mean, all the conservators know that myth of the museum is a lie. They know that time actually passes, in the vault. I guess what I'm saying is that at the highest levels, at the philosophical level, the museum needs to be an institution that embraces time instead of tries to deny it.
I take that, but take it in a sort of twisty way, which is that when you walk into a museum and you see a label, you are looking at something there now, whether it's the Assyrian reliefs from 2,000 years ago or the new commission by DuBois from a month ago. But the label's not going to say that. The label's going to say, 3000 BC or EC or whatever, or 1998. And so what we're compelled to think as museum visitors is, here is something that came from then. This is a Roman tomb sarcophagus, or this is a impressionist painting from the 1800s. But it is here, right? So the here and then, as opposed to the here and now. And I think what museums should get more interested in, or more involved in the 21st century, is the there and now, instead of the here and then. There is stuff happening outside the museum's walls that museums need to figure out how to adapt to faster, right? And in some of the works that you see upstairs, there are real-time generated imagery and data and so forth that's pulling stuff, or at least close to real-time, from the services that are out there that everyone else uses outside the museum. Apart from that sort of virtual reaching out and grabbing stuff that's outside the museum walls, I'd also like to see museum people get outside of their walls and go off into the community. If we want to nurture the creativity that's all around us, right? If we want to bring people into the contemporary art world, we need to reckon with the creative spirit that's outside the museum walls. And right now, it is not happening in a museum. In fact, I don't think it's ever happened in a museum, with some exceptions. If you go to maker spaces, if you go to Fab Labs, if you go to artist studios, if you go to places where people are, making the next generation of creative output, that's where you can make a difference. You can intercede there and document processes and nurture the work, the art, and other kind of creativity that eventually is going to make its way back into the walls. So I'm really interested in a kind of, centrifugal kind of expansion beyond the museum to what is happening now, but what's happening outside of the walls. And I don't think it's quite, I can see Rick might say, well, John, you're being ahistorical, and it is kind of a sort of trope of contemporary culture. Everything's now, we're not interested in the past. But I think it's more that everything that was old is still here, but it has been transformed over the centuries, years, minutes from what it was originally. And that's true for it's more true in any other genre for new media art.
So I just want to add to that artists are leading the way. So an artist like Luc DuBois, the piece that you've collected, is a piece that disallows the museum that's presenting it from pretending like the piece is eternal and that the museum is this isolated cube sort of separate from the world. With some of our objects, we can do that with certain kinds of painting or sculpture. We can present them in this more or less timeless, eternal sort of bubble. But with a work like the portrait that you just collected, it's very apparent. There is a real-time Twitter feed happening on the left-hand side. It's connected to the outside world. So the artists are leading the way. The museums just need to follow. And maybe you could describe that piece a little bit for people, since it's being collected right here at Bowdoin. It's very important, I think.
Oh, right. Well, it's very interesting. How many people have had an opportunity to see our Luc DuBois now? Virtually everyone. So for those of you who have seen it, and for those of you for whom it may be a new experience, I urge you to think about the implications of this 2016 artwork installed next to reliefs, which are quite literally carved in stone, 3,000 years old. And one of the things that I'm going to turn the conversation around to address in a moment is this issue of stasis versus something which is dynamic. But the DuBois piece, to describe it and its claims, which I think is a very good idea, it sort of forces us to grapple with this question of language and the very metaphors that are implicit in how we describe the work that we collect. So I would describe the portrait of the Duray-McKesson piece as being a portrait of Duray-McKesson. I think that the piece actually is officially called 32 Questions for Duray-McKesson. Interestingly, the title of the work evolved a little bit over time. in fact, as the artist sort of began to think about what the real significance of that work was to him. And I think for Luke, it was less about Luke's intervention into Duré's life and more about capturing his involvement and connection to the Bowdoin community. So it's actually a piece that asks Duré to circle back and to look at his relationship to Bowdoin. And it was a piece that was developed very much in concert with Bowdoin students. So to John's point about what it means to turn the museum inside out and to ask it to make interventions or to have a relevance that goes beyond its walls, that was very much something that was important to Luke. And so students here at Bowdoin actually crowdsourced the questions that Luke put to Duré. If you have an opportunity to look at that piece, you'll see that it's segmented and that each section of the work is based around a particular question that was raised by one of the students. Over in the right-hand section of the screen are tags, subject tags, that Luke has devised that enable him to call up tweets, which scroll along the left-hand side of the screen, so that there is an intersection developed between the video of McKesson and real-time tweets. But if you look at the scroll, you'll see that they're dated. So there are some that don't have a year after them. Those are the 2016 tweets. And then we get a sense of time because the ones that have been done in previous years actually have the year affixed to them. So we're, I think, forced through our interaction with that work to be very cognizant, not just of the way in which information is flowing in, but I think Luke invites us to be cognizant of how the way in which Duré is continuing to evolve as a human being in real time changes the way in which we look back on that video, which is actually anchored in March of 2016. I think one of the reasons that it was exciting for McKesson to be involved with that piece is, of course, because of his significant connection to Bowdoin, his sense of being a part of history here, but also because he recognized that one of the very interesting things that portraits do, I think, is make us aware of the passing of time, because we're aware of the fact that we change. And we're aware that, just as for, Oscar Wilde and his fictitious portrait of Dorian Gray, there is this change that we are subject to as organic beings, which theoretically works of art are supposed to be immune from. And I think Luke asks us to re-examine that relationship through an artwork which is dynamic. But it raises a really interesting question in my mind, which I want to put to both of you, which is the issue of medium. So one of the things that museums aspire to do, I think, is to be aware of medium specificity. We somehow have an idea that the aspirations of works of art are rooted in the physical form that they take. They're rooted in the way in which a given medium, whether it be paint, stone, video, perhaps even data on a chip, captures a particular idea. But one of the things that I think is so interesting about new media, time-based media, moving image work, is that we have to accept, I think, as curators, as preservationists, as collectors, that we can no longer adhere to even the aspiration of fixedness, which perhaps really begins to change what it means to think about our stewardship of works of art as we aim to perhaps deliver them forward to future generations. And I wonder, especially given the topic of your book, Recollection, if you could comment a little bit on that challenge.
Sure. Well, one of the things I've noticed, thus my call for fellow museums to collect more of this stuff, this is what we need to do, is there are thousands and thousands and generations now of artists making new media work. There are thousands of places that are exhibiting this work and showing it, and there are lots and lots of people who are writing about it in various forms too, but relatively few collecting it. And that includes private collectors and museums. And I think part of that is because, we have to be fair and say that it's not just new media artists among contemporary artists who are forcing, the museum and the institution to think about its connectedness to the outside world, temporality, to time. A lot of artists are doing that in different media. But I think museums are comfortable with containing that debate in a discursive space, in the gallery, and not in the vault. And what new media artists do when they choose their medium is not only through their intellectual exercises and the content and the subject of the work, but through the use of their medium, they're forcing that argument a little deeper in the museum. They're forcing us to reconsider our staid traditions and our operations at a very low sort of primal level. They're forcing us to change in a way that a contemporary painter isn't. And I think that's, it's a bit threatening and challenging, but of course it's also an opportunity for us to become, yet again, relevant.
And I think the curators fool themselves when they think that the history is stored in stony relics, that's the way we keep culture alive. There are indigenous stories of prehistoric animals that, lived well before civilization, that continue to be told and have been authenticated by examining bones of the creatures that they describe. Even when we look at stone, we saw the Assyrian reliefs upstairs. They've been graffitied. They've been changed over time, right, by the users who came later. And Richard Holliger, who teaches in my digital curation program, pointed out that we think of stone tablets from that period as the ultimate sort of survivability, right? That's how culture survives, is by being chiseled into something hard and durable. But in fact, the stone tablets were often chiseled off because stone was in short supply, that kind of limestone, and so something else was chiseled on. So in fact, it was kind of erased, or a palimpsest sometimes, where you can sort of see the old through the new. Whereas clay tablets from that period, which you would think, oh, clay, it's going to crack and crumble away. How is a 3,000-year-old clay tablet going to survive? But they survive because they were reused. They were used in other buildings, and then they can take apart the building and find these records that existed because they were built into something else. So the idea of something that being malleable, as being fluid, as being more adaptable than something solid and rigid, may be the way that even ancient artifacts survived, and we should be looking at the new media artists that Rick points out for a model of how new artifacts can survive.
I just want to point out that the video ended.
I think it's been reset.
Yeah, starting.
So, John, one of the things that I admire so much about your approach to this challenge is your ability to sort of succinctly summarize the necessity to change in order to preserve. This wonderful sort of interesting paradox, as it were. The necessity that we remain nimble in order to do something that can, in fact, be sustained for generations. And something else that I admire about both of your practices is an implicit desire to move the conversation, to push beyond institutional boundaries, to bring in other voices. And so I'm going to use that as a segue, actually, to reach out to our audience, because I know that there are some, everybody here has a very interesting contribution to make. I know that some of you are experts yourselves in the field of digital media, making, using, manipulating it. And I'd love to open the floor to your questions. Or rebuttals.
Thank you. I have a question which actually stems from the work that's in the DuBois show right now, the Dre McKesson work, but also which might extend to other case studies that you've encountered, which is the question of if Twitter is one of the media from which this generative portrait draws, what happens when that changes, and what is the artist's role in maintaining this work, altering this work? Is it the same as it was before? What happens to the status of the artwork in that case?
I have some thoughts, but it might be useful to hear from the director of the museum that collected the work.
Well, I'll be really interested to hear from these guys and from you, but it's a really interesting question. We're lucky that Luke is young, vibrant. We anticipate many, many more years of being able to consult with Luke about his work. But Jon actually helped to pioneer some strategies for addressing this question with his variable media questionnaire, which was developed by the Guggenheim, and really is, I would describe it as the foundational document actually for thinking about new media preservation. And I think it gives us some strategies for thinking about what the intention of the artist was, what are some of the essential aspects of this piece that we think need to be preserved in order to maintain as much of the spirit of that work as we possibly can. But actually, one of the things that I like about collecting new media work is precisely that I think it does force us to reflect upon the claims of the museum. And really, when we stop to think about it, as Jon was pointing out, the stone of the Assyrian reliefs has already changed. We have a fabulous group of colleagues and conservators. They exist because we know artworks change. Sometimes it's, sometimes we can anticipate changes to oil paints. We're aware that pastels or other things may fade if they're exposed to light. We know, unfortunately, that sometimes accidents befall works of art. They are physical pieces, and as such, they may in some ways not be as durable as media that we understand have the capacity to migrate. And so I think ultimately recognizing that Twitter is unlikely to survive forever, I think, recognizing that even the very computer that is playing the data is unlikely to survive. Really, it becomes this issue of networking. And sort of back to that image of Ellen DeGeneres earlier, one of the reasons that broadcast so quickly is that there was a network that existed to get that thing out across the world. I think what we do as curators, and this is part of the reason I think conversations become so important as curators and museum people, is we help feed those artworks into a larger network that enables that data, that information to survive beyond its being locked into a specific physical container. But it means that we have to accept going forward that there are inevitably aspects of the quote-unquote original format that we'll have to document, but which we are unlikely to be able to hold on to forever. So that's what we'll do, is to document the piece and to accept that it will indeed be migrated forward.
So indeed, this is where new media artists are pushing operationally at the museum, because one thing we need to do is ask the artist, early on. This is what the variable media questionnaire is all about, is ask early on, what are we allowed to do, Luke, with this work, when we need to change it? And already in the course of just digital art preservation, the various papers and conferences and the discourse around that, I've already noticed there's a sort of emerging professional thread that is seeking to mitigate the influence of the artist in these conversations. Various ways of discounting the artist. Well, you don't want to rely on the artist's intent too much. No, this and that and the other thing. Oh, we love artists, but, and I think it's just, it's putting us to the test. Well, what is the museum's relationship to the artist then in preservation? Is that an activity we can just exclude them from? We're happy to see them at the loading dock when we take their paintings, but for the rest of it, you can just go home, thank you very much. You're not really involved in these bigger discussions. So I would be asking Luke with this work, in fact, maybe I will ask him just for the heck of it, but one thing with that might be to, sort of take a snapshot frozen in time. You could record it sort of over a period of, you'd have to choose a period of time to record it, and thus represent maybe the historicity of it. The fact that Twitter existed now, this is what a tweet looked like, this is what the work looked like when Twitter worked. But I'd be wondering if in 50 years, I'd say, Luke, there are bound to be other sort of social media networks that exist in the future. Can we retool the work so that it would just tap into those feeds instead of this? Because that's really preserving the spirit of the work and keeping it alive. And as a museum director, I'd probably be wondering, do we have the capacity to do both of those? Because wouldn't it be great to have the frozen in time snapshot and some sort of a live version that you could sort of trot out both at any moment in time? I've been talking a lot.
and the questionnaire, the variable media questionnaire that Rick actually helped to refine, asks those questions and offers multiple pathways forward. This happened to a museum in Germany that had a little a sort of robotic ballerina that responded to tweets. And Twitter changed its API, totally screwing over not just that artist, but many startups based on the old Twitter API, an API being a way to access data that you can reuse for yourself. And there were, as Rick said, a number of solutions, some of which include storing the data locally, another's migrating to the new API, another is using an emulated pool of Twitter that's out there. For example, the Library of Congress has been storing tweets since 4 years ago, 3 years ago. Okay, so they've got like all of Twitter, right, backlogged for a couple years. And the fourth solution, besides what I would call storage, migration, and emulation, is reinterpretation, where you say, Twitter's dead because it's not relevant anymore. Let's go to the platform that is relevant, and let's rewrite the piece for that new platform, whether it's Snapchat or Slack or whatever.
Can I just return to the image, the Ellen DeGeneres selfie? Because when I saw that, I thought, and forgive me, John, but the network.
Oh, there goes John again.
the network that is in place that made that image so viral is capitalism, and its handmaiden celebrity. More than the internet, isn't it? More than the fact that there was Twitter or the internet is the fact, that's why it didn't take us 18 years, is because we already know these people because we consume their media artifacts, on an almost daily basis. And that woman from Bangladesh, we don't, so it took us 18 years.
I would say that's fair, except that my kids talk a lot more about memes created by random people across the US than they do about Ellen DeGeneres. And these are, if you have children, they're constantly referring to and passing on these little videos, Vine videos, or images that have been created. Lolcats were one of the first examples, but now they're just sort of like a constant stream of these. And almost none of them are created by celebrities. I'm not saying that there isn't capitalism and there isn't a foregone sort of networks of influence, but I do find that the way these things propagate offer museums and preservationists a really interesting model for gathering data about context that we didn't have before.
When I saw the image, it reminded me of an event that we were actually both at a long time ago at Berkeley, which was a conference on preserving new media art. And Kurt Bolliker from the Long Now Foundation said, well, there's one genre of internet content that I'm not worried about being preserved, porn. And we all got a good laugh out of it, and of course he's right. And it turns out that same formula doesn't really work for new media art. But that comment lingered with me, both because it was poignant and succinct and also funny, but it made me wonder if there's some sort of element of economic viability, which underlies the selfie as much as it does porn, that we're not considering, that may be necessary, that it's more than the technology and the good intent of museums, but there's something else going on. The stuff that survives has this sort of economic viability, and I sort of wonder how we translate that impetus, that momentum to new media artworks. Is the existing art world market and museum funding, are those the appropriate vehicles to provide that impetus, or should we be looking somewhere else, somewhere darker?
Well, I'll give the example, maybe not so dark, but of another model that museums and new media artists in general can look at. Scott Snibbe is an interactive artist, somewhat well known, not super well known in museums and so forth. And he cut his teeth making these interactive installations where you'd walk onto the floor and there'd be like these tiles, and as you stepped on one, it would create a graphic and a sound to go with it, and you could create this kind of music by walking around the room. So they cost $50,000, and maybe a couple hundred people would see it in some art venue in Northern England, whatever. And then one day he's decided, I could take a lot of the same code and I could repurpose it for a totally different platform. Go outside of the white cube, go to the iPad. Okay, it's also a kind of flat surface that you can touch with your hands instead of your feet. Doesn't have exactly the same immersive experience, but you get some of it. Woke up and saw one morning that he was the top downloaded app in the iStore under entertainment, in the Apple Store under entertainment. He estimates 500,000 people are walking around with his artwork in their pocket. That's a platform, a canvas that artists and museums can project to. And I'm not saying just the iPad itself, but the idea of, again, think outside of the box. Think of all the different ways that you can connect to people. And this is a lowly new media artist, not a person with Ellen DeGeneres' stature or influences, but simply kind of touched a nerve. Are all artists going to touch a popular nerve? No. But if we can, kind of project ourselves out into that bigger universe, I think we can tap into resources that can benefit all of the artists.
And to the same extent that new media artists are interrogating the institution, I think they're implicitly and some explicitly interrogating the market. But any more questions, rebuttals? Nothing.
Hello, wonderfully interesting, especially this last sequence of comments. Thank you, Ellen, for that provoking question. As I do a form of curatorial work as a classical musician, and the question of composer intent or artist intent is constantly at the forefront of discussions about playing music that's, even 5 years old. I work with a lot of modern composers directly with their music, and I've found it very confusing and very contradictory to the movement we call the authentic movement of early music, where looking at original sources is really important. Where we don't have the composer alive today, we may have some words or something written, but there's not a lot. Beethoven said a few things. We don't have very much from Bach himself. We have some things from his son. Living composers vary in their intent in terms of being very flexible. Oh, sure, you can play it that way, or you might suggest a change even in the score itself, in the actual notes. And they might say, yeah, that sounds, or others will say, no, you can't change that. I wanted it this way. So it almost makes me want to have Luc Dubois right here with us to find out. And then for me, it's, well, at what point does the work stop being either about the artist or belonging to the artist and becomes part of this? You mentioned, pull the artwork up to the back door and, we don't need you anymore kind of thing. And I'm wondering, in your discussions and work with installing exhibitions of new media art, what is that relationship? What is your personal philosophy about relating to the artist and the importance of the artist in exhibiting the work, talking about its meaning, versus where does the artist end and the work becomes part of the larger, more universal discussion?
I have just one quick, it isn't a response to that very comprehensive and very large set of questions, but that the visual arts really should be looking to the performing arts and music in particular when we're talking about this stuff. I think John was very right to bring that up. And we've talked between us in the past about what does a score look like for preserving media art and how does that relationship work. The only thing I want to mention now is just one thing, and that is the idea, the analogy of the conductor. That I sort of think that as much as new media artists are analogous to musicians, the curators of new media in the future probably need to think of ourselves more as conductors than as traditional curators, in the sense that we have a bigger hand in interpreting the artwork as it's brought back to life hundreds of years in the future. This is not something curators are comfortable with, visual art curators. We like to stay back and be objective. The work should speak for itself, and we can say something over here, but it's clearly bracketed aside. And we don't like to put our own interpretation in front of the work between the viewer. But of course, conductors in the musical sense are, very comfortable with the idea that their conducting is a form of artistry. There's the musician, there's the conductor. It's very interpretive. You can't go too far, you break the work, so they've negotiated these boundaries, and they have this comfort level with variability and change and interpretation that I think that visual arts curators would do well to learn from.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think we should change wall text and wall labels. Right now, a wall label says, R. Luc Dubois, comma, Missing Connections, 2015, or whatever it is. And then it says one medium, and it says one dimensions underneath that, and one collection. And I really think that should be just busted open and become a many-to-many connection. So the conductor, the reperformer of the work, should be credited and also get blame, right, if they did it wrong, because in many cases the artist isn't even going to be present. In some cases there'll be a collegial collaboration, but obviously in the future there won't be anymore. So in the cases where there's a sufficient amount of variability and requirement for that reinterpretation, you wouldn't say here's a Beethoven concerto and not mention the pianist, right? I think the same should be true of wall labels. It should also indicate what the medium is now and what the medium used to be, and what the years that it started and what the years that it was recreated. I documented one new media work that went through 23 variations in 18 months. That's amazing. But if you're a new media artist, you know that, because anytime you make something, you're constantly making changes to keep the thing alive. In his era, Bach was constantly going around futzing with the organs of wherever he was going to perform, right, to get them to sound just right, and sometimes customizing them in ways that, he left them, they were different than when he started. There's no default setting for an organ. It's got to be orchestrated for each performance. And now people think, well, that's Bach's piano concerto. No, Goldberg variations weren't on a piano. There wasn't a piano, right? We have changed that in the process of understanding how to keep that music alive. So I agree with Rick. I think it's a very instructive example for today's digital media.
And it's interesting, one thing I might just add to the conversation is the fact that I think it challenges some of our models for creativity. In that, I think the notion that there is a single instance of a work that is the correct instance, which has been sort of an illusion that I think visual art museums have embraced for a long time, is challenged in really exciting ways by new media. It is inherently collaborative, and I think the point that Rick makes and that Jon makes, that there are many hands at work in realizing something, is, to my mind, one of the most exciting and important aspects of working with new media. And it's interesting, I think one fundamental challenge we may have, sort of to go back to the market, if we think about the market as an index for how something is valued or understood by audiences, is the idea that the quote-unquote original manifestation is somehow more important or more valuable than later manifestations. And we see that traditionally with photographic objects. Usually the so-called vintage work is considered to be more valuable than subsequent printings from the same negative, and even if they're by the same artist, which is extremely intriguing and suggests that there may be a way in which we have tended as visual art museum people to think about a single instance in time, an eternal now, as it were, as being the one and only original instance that we are trying to recreate, that we are trying to reconnect with. And actually, I think what becomes very exciting from my standpoint, politically, creatively, is the idea that new media gives us new ways to think about how we interact with one another, and what collaboration looks like, and maybe even what collaboration looks like over time. We'll take one final question.
I do need to take what George just asked you one more step, or maybe it's a backward step, but it's more specific to this art exhibition. You wouldn't take Beethoven and in one auditorium play one of his symphonies, a sonata, one of his concertos, all at the same time. Now, we have this artwork going on in a room and a half, of which we have a cacophony of sound because there are multiple pieces of work up on that wall with a lot of sound coming out of them. And I've kind of mumbled about this before. So, two questions is, would this exhibition be better if you had a bunch of soundproof rooms with single pieces of Luke's artwork, so you could really listen, visualize each piece of work in its own medium? Did he have also any input as to how this was arranged in this particular museum, what size screen it's on, how loud the sound is from any one of his pieces?
I definitely welcome other perspectives, and I think you raise such an interesting question, and it's one that actually we've been thinking a lot about. So
I'll take the last question first, which is about Luke's involvement in the installation. And we are so lucky that he was able to be with us actually for about 10 days leading up to the installation of the exhibition. So he was definitely involved, and he helped us to think about and establish the sound levels for the different pieces. And I'm sure you've noticed that a number of pieces do in fact have headphones associated with them. I think this question, and George and others are undoubtedly better positioned, and you probably are too, to say something about whether should Beethoven and Bach have had the opportunity to have competing sounds, might they have experimented with that? And it's hard to say. They lived in a slightly different moment. And of course, there was the introduction of the symphony orchestra and so forth, which brings different instruments into concert with one another, as we say. But the question of how the different sound pieces interact in that exhibition has been on my mind. One of the things that I've been thinking about is the fact that when we're in a visual art museum, we usually look at things. We don't traditionally tend to listen to things. And so that becomes kind of interesting in terms of the model of how museums are constructed. Our museum is, that part of the building is well over 100 years old, finished in 1894. It was designed, I think, very impressively to exhibit visual art. Its purpose was not to exhibit sound-based pieces. And so I think that's one thing that intrigues me. Something else that intrigues me is that it's very seldom in the real world that we are in anechoic chambers. It has been experimented with by artists. And interestingly, there's a great, I think that this is James Turrell, maybe it's Robert Irwin, but there's a story by a relatively recent artist who tried that. Maybe it was even John Cage. I'll have to go look it up. But maybe it was John Cage, yeah. So he went into an anechoic chamber, and he went in there and he got really frustrated. And he got frustrated because they had screwed things up. He went in there, it was not quiet. And eventually the experiment ended, and he left that chamber, and they said, well, what did you think? And he said, well, it was interesting, but you didn't create something that doesn't have sound. And then he realized that what he heard was his own body. And that, I think, is really intriguing in terms of what it means to live, to change, to grapple with different sorts of sensory perception. So I agree that there's definitely a lot of different sound currents in that installation. I have found that my ears accustom themselves to that space just as my eyes accustom themselves to lower light or higher light experiences. And I think it raises an interesting question about what art means, how it challenges us, and whether or not we want to pull things into isolation, which perhaps then prevents other sorts of relationships from occurring. But I take your point that it is definitely an interesting challenge, and it raises some great questions. So I'm glad that you brought that up. As a musician, somebody trained with a PhD in musical composition, Luke did not let us off the hook in terms of grappling with sound. And whatever challenges it poses to us, I'm glad he didn't let us off the hook. So thank you. And I think, if you will pardon the pun, that is a great note on which to conclude, with a nod back to our friend Luke, who in absentia has brought us together. We really appreciate your time. We appreciate your being with us this afternoon, and we look forward to many future conversations. So thank you.
Thanks, Anne.
And we're happy to take any other questions for those of you who want to stay.